Hi, friends, welcome back to True Crime Echoes. You know, we've all grown up with the polished stories about America's founding fathers. The cherry tree George Washington supposedly chopped down. Thomas Jefferson, the genius who wrote that all men are created equal. Benjamin Franklin flying a kite in a lightning storm and discovering electricity. They're neat stories, easy to remember, but here's the thing. They're not the truth. The real men behind those myths were far more complicated, far more human, and honestly much darker than we were ever taught in school. In this episode, I want to peel back those layers. We'll meet Washington, Jefferson, and Franklin, not as statues or marble busts, but as real people, flawed, brilliant, hypocritical, even scandalous, because sometimes the history we weren't told is the most revealing of all. So grab a seat, settle in, and let's dig into the dark history of the Founding Fathers. Chapter 1: Breaking the Myths. When I think back to what we were all taught in school about the so-called Founding Fathers, I realize just how polished and sanitized those stories really were. We were told about George Washington and his wooden teeth, about a cherry tree he supposedly chopped down, and about Benjamin Franklin flying a kite in a lightning storm to discover electricity. And of course, Thomas Jefferson was always portrayed as the man of freedom, the one who believed all people were created equal. But let's be honest, those stories sound neat and heroic because they were meant to. They were myths written to turn flawed human beings into national icons. The truth is more complicated. Washington never had wooden teeth carved out of oak. Franklin didn't invent electricity on a stormy night with a kite. And Jefferson, the man who wrote about liberty, kept hundreds of people enslaved. These aren't just quirky details that got left out of the classroom. They reveal something deeper, something we should pay attention to: the fact that history has been edited for us, smoothed over, and made easier to swallow. That realization always makes me uncomfortable, because it means the version of America's past that we inherited isn't entirely honest. And if the foundation is shaky, how much of what we think we know today is built on half-truths? For me, that's not just an academic question. It's a reminder that history isn't about marble statues and perfect heroes. It's about people, messy, contradictory, sometimes brilliant, often hypocritical people. I remember the first time I dug into these stories, really dug in beyond the surface. It hit me how little I actually knew about the Founding Fathers as human beings. Not just the symbols they became, but the lives they lived, the choices they made, the contradictions they embodied. That gap between the myth and the reality is where the real story lies. And honestly, it's much darker and far more interesting than anything I ever read in a school book. So in this story, I want to strip away the marble, the myths, and the national slogans. I want to talk about George Washington, the man who carried lifelong insecurities about his education, the plantation owner who relied on enslaved labor, and the general who stumbled his way into starting a war. I want to look at Thomas Jefferson, the brilliant writer and political thinker who also lived a double life full of contradictions and scandals. And I want to get to know Benjamin Franklin, not the lightning-taming scientist of legend, but the sharp-tongued printer, the politician, the womanizer, and yes, the man who took naked air baths in front of his window. What strikes me about all of this is how easily we still slip into worshiping these men, as if acknowledging their flaws somehow diminishes the country they helped build. I don't think it does. In fact, I think it makes the story more honest, more human, and ultimately more valuable. Because when we hold on to the myths, we risk turning history into a cult. But when we confront the truth, we learn not just who they were, but who we are and who we might still become. This isn't about tearing them down for the sake of it. It's about facing the complexity, and sometimes facing the darkness. That's what I want to explore with you here. So let's go back. Let's meet these men, not as statues or saints, but as people. And let's start with the one who became America's very first president, George Washington. Chapter 2: George Washington, the man behind the myth. When you hear the name George Washington, what's the very first image that comes to mind? For most people, it's that stiff portrait of him, with the powdered white hair, maybe a dollar bill, or the cliché about him never telling a lie. If you're like me, you might have even grown up with the story of the cherry tree. You know, the one little George chopping down his father's favorite tree, then bravely confessing, "I cannot tell a lie." It sounds noble, doesn't it? Almost too noble. And that's because it was. The story was made up years after his death by a preacher who was trying to sell books. It wasn't history, it was marketing. Just like the myth of his wooden teeth, they weren't wood. They were actually a gruesome collection of ivory animal teeth, and most disturbingly, human teeth, many of which came from enslaved people. But when you're trying to craft a national hero, you don't put that in the textbooks. You put in Cherry Tree's honesty and dentures made of wood. It sounds more wholesome. That's the version of Washington most of us were fed. But beneath all the myth-making was a man who was far more complicated and honestly far more interesting. Childhood and family background. George Washington was born in 1732 in Westmoreland County, Virginia. His family wasn't the wealthiest in the colony, but they weren't poor either. They were what we'd call upper middle class by plantation standards. His father Augustine owned land-enslaved workers and had ambitions for his children. The plan was to send George, like his older brothers, to England for the best education money could buy. That was the way elite Virginia families groomed their sons for power. But tragedy cut that plan short. When George was just 11 years old, his father died. And with that loss, the dream of studying abroad vanished. His mother didn't have the funds to send him overseas. Instead, George attended a local school on and off, picking up math, surveying, and a bit of science. He never became a strong student in writing or language. Some say he struggled with dyslexia. This early end to his formal education would haunt him for the rest of his life. He carried a quiet insecurity about it even when he was leading armies and eventually a nation. Imagine being the first president of the United States and still feeling like you're not educated enough. That was George. And while he was trying to learn, he also had to step up at home. Because in colonial Virginia, when a father died, the eldest son usually inherited control of the household. George wasn't the eldest of all his father's children, but his older half-siblings had already moved out. That left him barely a teenager as the man of the house. At 12 years old, George was responsible for finances, land, and helping raise younger siblings. Schoolwork quickly took a back seat to survival. By 13, he had dropped out. Early influences. But George wasn't entirely alone. He had an older half-brother, Lawrence Washington, who became a huge influence on him. Lawrence was 14 years older and already something of a war hero. He had studied in England, served in the British Army, and even fought in a battle against Spain. When he came back to Virginia, he built a grand estate called Mount Vernon. Lawrence took George under his wing almost like a guardian. He exposed him to military culture, politics, and the lifestyle of Virginia's elite. For a boy who had been forced to grow up too soon, Lawrence represented both guidance and opportunity. In 1751, when Lawrence fell ill with tuberculosis, doctors suggested he travel somewhere warmer to recover. The Caribbean, maybe. Lawrence chose Barbados, and George insisted on going with him. For George, it was his first time leaving the colonies, his first real exposure to a wider world. But it didn't go the way he expected. Not long after they arrived, George caught smallpox. At the time, smallpox was deadly for most who contracted it. It left him bedridden, feverish, and scarred for life. But he survived, and that survival gave him something unexpected: immunity. Years later, when smallpox would devastate armies, George was one of the few leaders who could walk among the infected without fear. In a strange way, that trip changed history. Unfortunately, it didn't save Lawrence. He returned from Barbados weaker, and within a year he was dead. George was devastated. Lawrence had been his mentor, his protector, his role model. But Lawrence also left George something else: his estate, Mount Vernon. At just 20, George Washington inherited one of the grandest properties in Virginia. Early military career and a big mistake. But George wasn't satisfied with just being a farmer. Inspired by his brother, he wanted to be a soldier. In 1752, at 20 years old, he began his military career with the British Colonial Army. It was an ambitious move, and for a time it seemed like the perfect fit. Except his very first major assignment nearly ruined him. By the 1750s, tensions were high between the British who controlled the colonies and the French who were pressing down from Canada. Both sides wanted the Ohio River Valley a region already home to native peoples, who were trying often desperately to protect their land from European greed. In 1754, young George was sent to scout reports of French soldiers encamped near the Ohio River. What he found was worse than rumors. The French were there, and they outnumbered his small force badly. He should have scouted, reported back, maybe even opened negotiations. Instead, George panicked. He and his men ambushed the French camp. In the chaos, they killed about 10 soldiers, including a French diplomat. This was a disaster. Killing a diplomat was considered an act of war, and it was. George Washington's rash decision lit the spark that set off the French and Indian War, a conflict that lasted 7 years and pulled in European powers. His superiors were furious. The French branded him an assassin. He had turned a tense standoff into a full-blown war. Can you imagine America's first president started his career by triggering an international conflict through a panicked gunfight in the woods? That's the part they never tell you in school. Personal life and quirks. Despite the blunder, George's career didn't end. He learned from it, rebuilt his reputation, and became known as a capable strategist. But his personal life tells us even more about who he was. In 1759, at 27, George married Martha Custis, a wealthy widow with 2 young children. Martha brought not only emotional companionship, but also significant wealth and property. The marriage solidified George's place among Virginia's elite. They never had children together, likely due to George's earlier smallpox infection or Martha's own health. Still, by most accounts, he treated her children John and Patsy as his own, writing them affectionate letters and offering guidance. But Washington wasn't all discipline and seriousness. He loved to dance. He would stay out at balls until 4 in the morning, losing himself on the dance floor. He also adored dogs. He had as many as 30 at a time. Some of their names are legendary Sweet Lips Madame Moose Drunkard. He bred his own hunting hounds and even kept careful records of their lineages. Behind the general's stern portraits was a man who found joy in music movement and his animals. Rise as a revolutionary leader. Fast forward to the Revolutionary War, and Washington's story shifts again. Despite his shaky start, he became the face of the American fight for independence. He endured winters intense, rallied ragged soldiers, and crossed the Delaware River in one of the most iconic moments of the war. Twice horses were shot out from under him in battle. 4 times bullets tore through his coat. Yet he survived over and over. Soldiers saw him as untouchable, almost chosen by fate. But survival didn't mean comfort. Washington lived with constant hardship, disease, and the weight of commanding a fragile army against the world's strongest empire. When the war finally turned in America's favor after the crucial victory at Yorktown, Washington's reputation was cemented. He wasn't just a general anymore. He was a national figure, the man people trusted to hold the young country together. Presidency and legacy. After independence, the Founding Fathers faced a new challenge: how to govern a nation that had never existed before. Washington was the obvious choice to lead. He presided over the Constitutional Convention and was unanimously chosen as the first president of the United States in 1789. 4 years later, he was unanimously re-elected. No campaign, no smear ads, no drama, just universal agreement that he was the man for the job. He became the first to sign the Constitution, the first to shape the office of the presidency, and the first to prove that power could be transferred peacefully. For all his flaws, Washington helped set the precedent that America wouldn't be ruled by kings. But the end of his life was anything but regal. In December 1799, after riding through snow and rain on his Virginia estate, he came down with a sore throat. It should have been nothing more than a cold. But doctors of the day believed in bleeding patients to remove illness. They drained 40% of his blood. Unsurprisingly, that didn't help. Within 2 days, George Washington was dead. Not from the cold, but from the cure. Darker truths and contradictions. Here's where the myths crumble the hardest. For years, people praised Washington for freeing enslaved people in his will. That's the version I heard too. But the truth is far less noble. Washington did write that the people he enslaved should be freed after his death, But when he died, ownership of those people passed to Martha Washington, and Martha wasn't ready to let them go. She freed a few only out of fear that they might kill her. The rest were kept in bondage until her death. Families were torn apart, children separated from parents, men and women divided among Martha's heirs. And remember, those famous false teeth. They weren't wood. They were carved from ivory, animal bone, and yes, human teeth taken from the mouths of enslaved people. When you picture Washington on the dollar bill, remember that smile. It wasn't heroic. It was built on the suffering of people who had no choice. For all his achievements, Washington's life embodies the contradictions of America's founding liberty for some bondage for others. Democracy written in ink, injustice carved into bone. Closing reflection. When I think about George Washington now, I don't see the flawless hero from elementary school. I see a survivor. He survived smallpox wars, political turmoil, and personal loss. He survived bullets disease and mistakes that could have ended him. And he carried those insecurities about education and legitimacy with him to the very end. Washington was a leader, yes, but also a man who relied on enslaved labor, who made devastating mistakes, and whose life was far messier than the marble statues suggest. To me, that doesn't diminish his story. It makes it real, because the truth is always more complicated than the myth. So the next time you pull out a dollar bill, think of him not as a saint, but as a man who danced until dawn, kissed his dog named Sweet Lips, and also carried the weight of America's contradictions on his shoulders. And as we turn from Washington, we move to the next founding father, a man even more complicated, more brilliant, and more hypocritical than the first. Let's talk about Thomas Jefferson. Chapter 3. Thomas Jefferson, the brilliant hypocrite. When we talk about Thomas Jefferson, we usually talk about the words he wrote. We hold these truths to be self-evident that all men are created equal. You've probably heard that line 100 times. It's engraved on buildings, quoted in speeches, treated like sacred scripture. And Jefferson was the man behind it. He was only 33 when he drafted the Declaration of Independence, and people hailed him as the voice of liberty. But here's the contradiction. The same man who wrote those words enslaved more than 600 human beings in his lifetime. He wrote about freedom with one hand while holding chains with the other. For me, that makes Jefferson one of the most fascinating and one of the most disturbing figures in American history. He was brilliant, he was visionary, and he was also a hypocrite of the highest order. Childhood and early life. Jefferson was born in 1743 in Virginia, into a wealthy family that owned a large plantation worked by enslaved people. He grew up surrounded by privilege, but also by loss. His father died when Thomas was 14. His mother was distant, and like many elite boys in Virginia, he was sent away to study. Unlike George Washington, Jefferson received a solid education. He studied at the College of William and Mary, where he immersed himself in philosophy, law, mathematics, and science. He played the violin, loved architecture, and read voraciously. People who knew him described him as quiet, reserved, but intellectually restless. From the beginning, Jefferson stood out as a thinker. While most men of his class were satisfied with managing estates, Jefferson dreamed of ideas. He sketched designs for buildings, tinkered with inventions, and scribbled notes about politics and freedom. But all of that existed in the shadow of slavery because his wealth, his very ability to spend hours reading and thinking, was built on the backs of enslaved laborers. Career beginnings and marriage. By the time he was in his mid-20s, Jefferson was practicing law and beginning his political career. He also married Martha Skelton, a wealthy widow. Their marriage was described as affectionate, even passionate. They had 6 children together, but only 2 survived into adulthood. The repeated loss of children devastated them both. Martha herself died young in 1782 after just 10 years of marriage. Jefferson was heartbroken. Some say he never fully recovered, but he also never remarried. Instead, he filled the void with his work and with another relationship, one that would become one of the most controversial in American history. Writing the Declaration of Independence. In 1776, Jefferson's reputation as a thinker paid off. At 33, he was chosen to draft the Declaration of Independence. He wrote quickly, drawing from Enlightenment philosophers like John Locke and from his own belief in reason and natural rights. When you read the document, it's easy to get swept up in the poetry, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. It's beautiful, inspiring, and it was radical for its time. Jefferson was writing not just for colonists, but for history. He knew these words would echo. But let's not forget what else was happening. While Jefferson was writing about liberty, dozens of enslaved people were working his land back home at Monticello. He knew the contradiction. Others knew it too. One of the original drafts of the Declaration even condemned slavery and the slave trade, but those lines were cut to appease Southern delegates. Jefferson didn't fight to keep them in. He signed his name to a version that sidestepped the issue. That choice set the tone for the rest of his life, publicly embracing freedom, privately profiting from bondage. Jefferson the politician. After independence, Jefferson served as governor of Virginia, diplomat to France, and eventually Secretary of State under George Washington. He was brilliant at writing, but not always skilled at governing. As governor, he fled the capital when British troops advanced, earning him accusations of cowardice. In France, he lived in luxury while observing the French Revolution, writing back about liberty while sipping wine in Parisian salons. Politically, Jefferson believed in small government states' rights and the power of the common farmer. He distrusted cities' banks and concentrated wealth. Ironically, he was also one of the wealthiest men in America. His own plantation, Monticello, was a symbol of both his genius and his hypocrisy. A beautiful estate he designed himself, maintained by enslaved laborers he refused to free. The Scandal of Sally Hemings. Now we come to the story that forces us to confront Jefferson not as a statue but as a man. Sally Hemings. Sally was an enslaved woman at Monticello. She was also the half-sister of Jefferson's late wife, Martha. Let that sink in. Martha's father had children with one of his enslaved women, so Sally was both enslaved and family. When Jefferson was 44 and serving as a diplomat in Paris, Sally was sent to accompany his daughter. She was 14 years old. That's when the relationship began. Historians debate the language we should use here. Was it an affair? A relationship? Let's be clear, Sally Hemings was enslaved. She couldn't consent. She had no power to say no. By any modern understanding, this was rape. Jefferson fathered at least 6 children with her. 4 survived. For generations, Jefferson's defenders denied the relationship. They called it slander. But DNA testing in the late 1990s proved it. Jefferson's lineage is directly tied to Sally Hemings's descendants. The truth was there all along, hidden in plain sight. Think about the contradiction. The author of All Men Are Created Equal kept his wife's half-sister enslaved and fathered children with her. Those children lived in bondage owned by their own father until he selectively freed a few of them later in life. For me, this is where Jefferson stops being a hero and becomes a mirror. He embodied America's ugliest paradox, a nation founded on liberty, built on slavery. Achievements as president. Despite the scandal, Jefferson rose to the presidency in 1801, becoming the 3rd president of the United States. He is remembered for major achievements: the Louisiana Purchase, which doubled the size of the nation, the Lewis and Clark Expedition, which charted new territories, and his efforts to reduce the national debt. He also founded the University of Virginia, which reflected his deep love for education and architecture. To this day, people point to his vision of America as a land of farmers, thinkers, and independent states. But his presidency was also marked by failures. His Embargo Act, which tried to punish Britain and France by cutting off trade, ended up devastating American merchants. His commitment to states' rights often left the federal government too weak to handle crises. And through it all, he never solved the contradiction at the heart of his life. He spoke against slavery in theory, but in practice he expanded it. By the time of his death in 1826, he still owned over 600 enslaved people. The end of his life. Thomas Jefferson died on July 4, 1826, 50 years to the day after the signing of the Declaration of Independence. In a strange twist of fate, his longtime rival and fellow founding father John Adams died just hours later on the very same day. It was as if history itself wanted to tie their names together. On his tombstone, Jefferson chose to highlight 3 things: author of the Declaration of Independence, founder of the University of Virginia, and author of the Virginia Statute for Religious Freedom. Notice what he didn't mention being president. For him, ideas mattered more than titles. But what his tombstone also doesn't mention is the part of his life that haunts his legacy, the hundreds of enslaved people at Monticello, the children he fathered with Sally Hemings, the hypocrisy baked into every corner of his world. Reflection. So how do we remember Thomas Jefferson? Do we celebrate him as a genius of liberty? A man who gave the world words that still inspire revolutions? Or do we condemn him as a hypocrite who preached equality while living off the labor of people he enslaved? I think the answer is both. Jefferson's words changed the world. They outlived him, outshone him, and became bigger than he ever was. But the man himself never lived up to them. He couldn't. Maybe he didn't want to. When I think of Jefferson, I think of the beauty of the words and the ugliness of the life behind them. And I think about how often we as a society choose the beauty over the ugliness because it's easier, because it's cleaner. But history isn't clean. It's complicated, messy, and uncomfortable. And maybe that's the point. Jefferson forces us to confront the contradictions at the heart of America liberty and slavery equality, and hierarchy ideals and hypocrisy. His story isn't just his own, it's the story of the country he helped create. As we leave Jefferson, we turn to another founding father, one who was less about lofty words and more about clever wit invention and scandal. Benjamin Franklin, the old man with the kite, the printer, the diplomat, and the eccentric who loved to shock people in every possible way. Chapter 4, Benjamin Franklin, the genius, the trickster, the myth. When I first learned about Benjamin Franklin in school, the story was simple. He was the guy who tied a key to a kite, flew it during a thunderstorm, and invented electricity. I mean, that image is everywhere, posters, cartoons, even history books. But here's the thing, it didn't happen. Not like that. That story, like George Washington's cherry tree or Thomas Jefferson's all men are created equal, was just another myth we were spoon-fed. Franklin didn't invent electricity. People already knew about it. And if he had really flown that kite during a storm the way the story goes, he probably would have been fried on the spot. Toasted. End of story. So, if the myth is wrong, who was the real Benjamin Franklin? To me, he's the most complicated of the founding fathers. Not because of hypocrisy, like Jefferson, or war hero status, like Washington, but because Franklin was everywhere. He did everything, and he was loved and hated for it. Early life, a boy, among 17 children. Benjamin Franklin was born in 1706 in Boston, the 15th of 17 children. Can you even imagine his father was a soap and candle maker struggling to feed all those mouths? Benjamin wasn't born into wealth, but he had something better: curiosity. He dropped out of school at 12, which meant his formal education was short. But like Washington, he taught himself. And unlike Washington, Franklin had a pen and a printing press. That combination gave him power. At just 12 years old, he became an apprentice to his older brother James, who ran a print shop. Printing was tough physical work. You had to set the type run, the press distribute the papers. But it was also the media of the day. If you controlled a press, you controlled the conversation. Silence. Do-good. The catfish that sparked a career. Now here's where Franklin's mischievous streak shows up. He wanted to publish articles in his brother's newspaper, but James refused. So Benjamin came up with a trick. He invented a fake persona, a middle-aged widow, named Silence Do-good. He slipped letters under the print shop door at night, and James, not knowing who wrote them, published them. Readers loved Silence Do-good. She was witty, sharp, funny, sometimes biting. Men even sent marriage proposals to the paper. But then the secret came out. Benjamin, the teenage apprentice, was behind it all. James was furious. But by then, Benjamin had proven himself as a writer. He didn't need his brother anymore. He packed his bags and moved to Philadelphia. That move changed his life. Philadelphia, and building a reputation. Philadelphia became Franklin's home, and in many ways the city that made him. He started his own print shop, bought a struggling newspaper, and transformed it into the Pennsylvania Gazette. It became one of the most widely read papers in the colonies. Franklin also started publishing Poor Richard's Almanac, a yearly book filled with weather forecasts, advice, proverbs, and humor. It was a mix of practical tips and witty sayings, things like early to bed, early to rise, makes a man healthy, wealthy, and wise. People ate it up. He sold thousands of copies every year for 25 years. By his 30s, Franklin was wealthy, influential, and known for his cleverness. But he wasn't just a businessman. He was a joiner. He loved clubs, societies, and civic projects. He helped start America's first lending library, the first fire department, and even the University of Pennsylvania. Franklin wasn't content to make money, he wanted to shape society. The inventor and scientist. And of course, Franklin loved tinkering. He invented bifocal glasses, the lightning rod, the Franklin stove, even a musical instrument called the glass harmonica. He didn't always patent his inventions either. He believed knowledge should benefit everyone, not just make him rich. That kind of thinking feels radical, even now. But Franklin was also an experimenter in more dangerous ways. He did study electricity, though not the way school books describe. His experiments were real, but the kite story got exaggerated. What he actually proved was that lightning was a form of electricity, and the lightning rod he invented saved lives by protecting buildings. So while he didn't invent electricity, he did something arguably more important. He made it practical. Personal life complicated and messy. Now, Franklin's personal life was, let's just say, unconventional. He married Deborah Reed, but the marriage wasn't exactly typical. For one, he had a son named William from another relationship. No one really knows who the mother was, and William would later become a loyalist during the Revolutionary War, siding with Britain against his own father. That father-son rift never healed. Even on his deathbed, Franklin barely left William anything. It was brutal. Franklin also had a reputation as a flirt. In France, he became famous for his charm with women, often older, wealthy ones, who found his wit irresistible. He leaned into the image of a rustic American, simple fur hats, witty conversation, a twinkle in his eye. The French adored him. Some even styled their hair in imitation of him, calling it coiffure à la Franklin. It's strange to picture this balding, older man from Philadelphia turning into a celebrity in Paris. But that's who Franklin was. He knew how to work a crowd. The political agitator. Now here's where Franklin shifts from printer and inventor to revolutionary. In the 1770s, Franklin got hold of letters written by the British governor of Massachusetts. These letters basically said that colonists didn't deserve the same rights as British citizens and that stronger military control was needed. Franklin leaked them to the press and the people exploded with anger. The Boston Tea Party happened not long after. When the British discovered Franklin's role, they dragged him into a public hearing in London and humiliated him. But instead of breaking him, it hardened his resolve. Franklin returned to America ready to push for independence. He became one of the key figures in the Continental Congress, helping draft both the Declaration of Independence and later the U.S. Constitution. War diplomacy and fame. During the Revolutionary War, Franklin's role was less about fighting and more about diplomacy. He went to France, persuading the French to support the American cause. Without French money, weapons, and troops, the revolution might not have succeeded. And Franklin made himself a celebrity there. The French loved his simplicity, his charm, his cleverness. While Washington was leading armies and Jefferson was writing documents, Franklin was securing alliances that made victory possible. The contradictions of Franklin. For all his accomplishments, Franklin wasn't perfect. He owned enslaved people early in his life, though he later became an abolitionist, speaking out against slavery near the end of his career. He was celebrated as a genius, but some contemporaries thought he was arrogant, a spotlight hog. John Adams once said Franklin's whole life was one continued insult to good manners. And Franklin had quirks. One of my favorites is his belief in air baths. Instead of bathing in water, he liked to sit naked in front of an open window, convinced that fresh air kept him healthy. Imagine walking past his house in Philadelphia and seeing that. Franklin didn't care. He thought he was onto something. Death and legacy. Benjamin Franklin died in 1790 at the age of 84. For the 18th century, that was ancient. Tens of thousands of people attended his funeral in Philadelphia. He died wealthy, influential, and beloved by many. But his relationship with his son William never healed. That fracture is part of his legacy, too. Today, Franklin isn't remembered as a president because he never was one. But he's on the $100 bill. In some ways, that feels fitting. He wasn't a head of state, but he embodied the hustle, the cleverness, the drive to invent and to profit that shaped America. Reflection. So how do we think of Franklin? To me, he's the most human of the founding fathers. Washington feels larger than life. Jefferson feels like a marble statue full of contradictions. But Franklin, he feels like someone you could have met at a coffee shop, or maybe more accurately, in a tavern. He'd be cracking jokes, pitching some wild invention, charming someone across the room, and probably taking notes for an article he planned to publish the next day. Franklin reminds us that history isn't just made by soldiers or politicians, it's made by writers, printers, and tricksters too. And as much as I laugh at the myths, I think the truth about Franklin is even better. He didn't need to invent electricity or be a president to be remembered. He just needed to be himself, flawed, funny, brilliant, and unforgettable. Chapter 5: Myths, Men, and the Cult of History. Looking back at George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, and Benjamin Franklin, I can't help but notice how different they really were from the polished portraits we've been fed since childhood. Washington wasn't just the stoic general with a powdered wig. He was a red-headed farm boy who dropped out of school, got smallpox scars, stumbled into starting a war, and kept 30 dogs with names like Sweet Lips and Drunkard. He survived almost everything life threw at him, but he couldn't escape the darker truth that his wealth, his teeth, and much of his power were tied to enslaved people. Jefferson was brilliant, sensitive, and deeply contradictory. He wrote the words, "All men are created equal," but kept more than 600 people in bondage. He argued for freedom while living in a house built on forced labor. And behind the marble statue was a man caught in scandal, entangled in a 40-year relationship with a woman he enslaved, Sally Hemings, who was also his wife's half-sister, and Franklin. He didn't invent electricity, but he lit up the world in his own way. He was the printer who became a philosopher, the trickster who pretended to be silenced do good, the diplomat who charmed the French, and the man who sat naked in front of an open window for his so-called air baths. He was witty, flawed, brilliant, and absolutely unforgettable. So what do we do with all of this? For me, the lesson is clear. We need to stop treating the founding fathers like saints, because when we put them on pedestals, we strip away their humanity, and with it the truth. They weren't gods. They weren't perfect. They were men complicated and messy who built a nation while carrying their own contradictions. And honestly, that makes me think about the stories we're told today. Which parts are myths, which parts are carefully edited to make leaders look flawless, and what truths are hiding in the shadows waiting for us to dig deeper. History isn't just about honoring the past, it's about learning from it. Not the sugar-coated version, but the raw one. Washington's survival, Jefferson's hypocrisy, Franklin's wit. They're all reminders that even people who shape the world are human. They make mistakes. They hold power and abuse it. They create, they destroy, and they leave behind legacies we still wrestle with. So the next time you look at a dollar bill, or see the words of the Declaration of Independence, or hear that kite and lightning story, I hope you pause. I hope you remember that behind every myth is a much messier truth. And maybe that truth is more valuable than the legend, because if we can learn to see the founding fathers as they really were, then maybe we can see ourselves more clearly too. And that's the dark history I wanted to share with you today. And that's the story I wanted to share with you today. When we strip away the myths, Washington, Jefferson, and Franklin stop being untouchable icons and start looking like real men. Men who built a nation, yes, but also men who carried secrets, contradictions, and flaws we can't ignore. To me, that's what makes history worth revisiting. It's not about worshiping the past. It's about understanding it. And maybe by seeing the truth more clearly, we can see ourselves more clearly too. Thank you so much for spending this time with me. If you enjoyed today's episode, make sure to subscribe and come back next week because we've got more dark history to uncover. Until then, stay curious, stay thoughtful, and I'll talk to you soon.